James Wilson had lived in his countryside home for over 15 years. At 47, he'd saved diligently during his career as a civil engineer to purchase this slice of paradise, a 3-acre property that sat at the edge of Oak Ridge Estates but wasn't technically part of the development or its homeowners association. The previous owners, an elderly couple who had built the house in the 1980s, had specifically ensured the property remained independent when the surrounding farmland was sold to developers in the early 2000s. James' land was the envy of many in the neighborhood. It included a spring-fed pond that attracted herons, ducks, and the occasional turtle sunning itself on half-submerged logs. A natural walking trail wound through the property, meandering around the pond and through a small wooded area of mature oak and maple trees that blazed with color each autumn. The trail had been created over decades, first by deer and later maintained by the previous owners who enjoyed evening strolls. When James purchased the home, he learned that the elderly couple had occasionally allowed trusted neighbors to use the trail. But James valued his privacy. It was one of the main reasons he'd chosen this particular property. After his divorce 6 years ago, the peaceful solitude of his land had become even more precious to him. He worked from home 3 days a week, often taking his laptop to the weathered wooden bench overlooking the pond where he could think clearly while watching the wind ripple across the water's surface. Within the first month of moving in, James had posted several tasteful but clear private property signs at the boundaries where his land met the Oak Ridge Estates development. He also installed a simple split-rail fence along part of the property line. Not tall enough to be unfriendly, but a clear demarcation nonetheless. Most of the residents understood and respected his boundaries. Some of the longtime neighbors even shared stories about the previous owners and expressed their appreciation that James maintained the natural beauty of the property rather than subdividing it as some developers had suggested. The occasional new resident would sometimes wander onto his property, but a friendly explanation was usually all it took to resolve any confusion. James wasn't unreasonable. He had even allowed Ms. Reynolds, a retired biology teacher from the neighborhood, to bring her grandchildren to the pond twice a year to collect water samples for impromptu science lessons. He joined them sometimes, enjoying her enthusiastic explanations about pond ecosystems. For 15 years, this arrangement had worked well. James maintained his privacy while still being on good terms with the Oak Ridge community. He attended the occasional neighborhood barbecue and contributed to the annual food drive, but generally kept to himself. The residents of Oak Ridge Estates had respected this balance, until Deborah Miller was elected as the new HOA president last month, running on a platform of enhancing community amenities and boosting property values. James had noticed for campaign signs throughout the neighborhood but paid little attention, assuming HOA politics didn't concern his independent property. He would soon discover how wrong he was. It began with 3 sharp knocks on James' door at 8:15 on a Saturday morning in early April. James had been enjoying his morning coffee on the back deck, listening to the spring birds and planning his weekend gardening, when the insistent knocking pulled him away. He wasn't expecting visitors, especially not this early on a weekend. Opening the door, he found a woman he vaguely recognized from the neighborhood. She wore a crisp navy blazer despite the casual weekend, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. A pearl necklace completed the look of someone dressed for business rather than a neighborly visit. "Good morning. I'm Deborah Miller, the new president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association," she announced with a wide smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped forward as if to enter. James didn't move from the doorway. "I've been meaning to come introduce myself properly," she continued, seemingly unbothered by remaining on the porch. "I've been reviewing our community assets and opportunities since taking office last month." Before James could even offer a perfunctory greeting, Deborah launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech about her vision for a more connected community. She gestured broadly toward his property with manicured hands. "As you may know, our residents have consistently expressed interest in having access to natural walking trails and outdoor recreation areas," she explained, pulling out a tablet from her designer tote bag. "I've been examining satellite images and old property maps of the area, and I've found the perfect solution." She turned the tablet toward James, showing him a crudely edited image of his own property with new labels, community trail, public picnic area, and neighborhood fishing spot superimposed over his pond. "The HOA will be opening this trail to all residents as a community amenity," she stated matter-of-factly. "We've already discussed installing proper gravel pathways, benches, and informational plaques about local wildlife. We'll handle all maintenance, of course, though we may need to remove some of those trees for safety reasons." James took a deep breath, trying to process this overwhelming presumption. He noticed Deborah was still talking now about liability waivers and scheduled hours of operation. "I'm sorry," James finally interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "There seems to be a misunderstanding. My property isn't part of Oak Ridge Estates or the HOA. This land is privately owned by me." Deborah's smile faltered momentarily before returning, now with a patronizing edge. Well, yes, technically. But you must understand that community needs sometimes transcend individual preferences. The previous owners allowed access, from what I've heard. Occasionally, to specific neighbors as a personal courtesy, James clarified. But I'm not interested in making my private property into a public park. I value my privacy, which is why I've had those signs posted for 15 years. As he spoke, James watched Deborah's expression transform. The pleasant mask dropped completely, replaced by narrowed eyes and a tight-lipped grimace. Her spine straightened as if physically preparing for battle. I don't think you understand how things work here, she said, her voice now clipped and cold. The community has needs. Property values and neighborhood desirability affect everyone. Your selfishness impacts all of us. Again, I'm not part of your HOA, James reiterated firmly. My property is private. Deborah's face flushed red as she collected her tablet and took a step back. We'll see about that, she said, her tone making the simple phrase sound unmistakably like a threat. This conversation isn't over, Mr. Wilson. She turned sharply and marched down his walkway, gravel crunching under her heels. James watched her retreat, a sinking feeling in his stomach, telling him this was only the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, James found himself increasingly baffled by the growing pile of official-looking correspondence from the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. The first letter arrived 3 days after Deborah's visit, printed on heavy cardstock with a gold-embossed HOA logo at the top. Reminder of community obligations, the bold heading declared. The body of the letter referenced Section 8.3 of the Oak Ridge Estates Covenant, claiming it required all properties adjacent to or visually connected with the neighborhood to maintain community standards and support neighborhood initiatives. The deliberately vague language was clearly designed to sound authoritative while saying very little of substance. It was signed with the flourishing Deborah Miller, HOA president, and included the names of the entire board at the bottom, though James wondered if they were actually aware of the letter's contents. The second letter arrived just 4 days later via certified mail, requiring his signature. This one had a more threatening tone, demanding he remove all private property and no trespassing signs within 72 hours or face punitive measures as allowed under Bylaws Section 12. It also included a printed copy of what it called the Community Enhancement Schedule, listing dates when landscape assessment teams would be visiting his property to evaluate potential trail improvements. The third letter, which appeared tucked into his doorframe after he returned from a grocery run the following weekend, was the most aggressive yet. It outlined non-compliance fines of $150 per day for continued obstruction of community improvement efforts. Attached was an invoice for $450, covering the previous 3 days with instructions for payment submission. James had initially tried to dismiss the absurdity of it all. He even laughed when showing the first letter to his brother during their weekly phone call. But as the communications grew more frequent and threatening, his amusement turned to genuine concern. Something about Deborah's intensity suggested she wasn't going to simply give up. On Tuesday evening, James pulled out the thick folder of property documents he kept in his home office safe. He spread them across his dining table, the original deed, property surveys, tax records, and the documentation from when the surrounding farmland had been sold to developers. Everything confirmed what he already knew. His property was completely independent of Oak Ridge Estates, with no HOA covenants or restrictions attached. He spent that night drafting a formal response. As an engineer, James was methodical and thorough, creating a timeline of events and a point-by-point rebuttal of each claim in the HOA letters. He included photocopies of relevant sections from his property documents, highlighted and annotated for clarity. He also printed Google Earth images showing the precise boundaries of his land and its clear separation from the HOA-governed properties. Rather than addressing his response solely to Deborah, James made copies for each HOA board member listed on the letterhead. He included a cover letter that was professional but direct, stating his position plainly. My property is not subject to HOA governance, has never been part of Oak Ridge Estates, and I have no legal obligation to comply with HOA demands regarding my private land. James drove to the post office the next morning, sending each letter via certified mail to ensure delivery could be tracked and confirmed. He also emailed digital copies to the board's official email address, blind copying his lawyer friend Michael, who had offered casual advice when James mentioned the situation during their monthly poker game. That evening, as James sat on his back deck watching the sunset reflect on his pond, his phone pinged with notifications. He had received 5 separate email responses from board members, all expressing surprise at the situation and promising to look into the matter. One even included an apology for any misunderstanding. James allowed himself a small smile of relief. Perhaps reason would prevail after all. But his moment of optimism was short-lived. Just as he was heading inside, he spotted a figure standing at the edge of his property, partially hidden by trees, taking photographs. Even from a distance, he recognized Deborah's distinctive posture and the flash of her pearl necklace in the fading light. Part 4. The community meeting. Deborah called an emergency HOA meeting, which James attended after seeing it announced on the community bulletin board. When he arrived, he discovered the meeting's sole agenda item was securing public trail access. Deborah had prepared a presentation complete with photos of James' property, proposed signage, and even a schedule for community trail hours. When James raised his hand to speak, Deborah tried to silence him by claiming only community members could participate. Several neighbors. The bright yellow flyer caught James' eye as he collected his mail from the community bulletin board near the Oak Ridge Estates entrance. Emergency HOA meeting, it proclaimed in bold letters. Thursday, 7 p.m., Community Center. Attendance esta Rowan July encouraged. The flyer listed only one agenda item, securing public trail access for residents. James felt a mixture of irritation and curiosity. He hadn't received any further communication from Deborah or the HOA board since sending his documentation package 5 days earlier. The responses from several board members had seemed encouraging, but this meeting notice suggested the matter was far from resolved. Thursday evening arrived with a spring thunderstorm that left puddles across the parking lot of the Oak Ridge Estates Community Center. James arrived 10 minutes early, surprised to find the room already half filled with residents. He recognized many faces, neighbors who waved politely, though some avoided eye contact. He chose a seat near the back, nodding hello to Ms. Reynolds, a retired biology teacher, who gave him a sympathetic smile. At precisely 7:00 p.m., Deborah strode to the front of the room, now filled with nearly 50 residents. She wore a red blazer that stood out sharply against the plain beige walls, her pearl necklace replaced by a gold chain with an oversized HOA pendant. 4 other board members sat at a table behind her, looking variously uncomfortable or confused. "Thank you all for coming to this important community meeting," Deborah began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "As many of you know, I was elected on a platform of enhancing our neighborhood amenities and increasing property values." She clicked a remote, and a projector illuminated the wall with an aerial view of the neighborhood, with James' property highlighted in bright red. "Tonight, we're discussing the exciting opportunity to secure public access to this natural area for all Oak Ridge residents," she continued, clicking through the photographs of James' pond, trail, and wooded area. James recognized the photos as those taken from the edge of his property a few evenings ago. What followed was a meticulously prepared 20-minute presentation. Deborah had created architectural renderings showing community improvements to his property, a widened gravel path, wooden benches strategically placed around the pond, informational signs about local wildlife, and even a small playground near the water's edge. She displayed a detailed community trail hours schedule, running from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. daily, with special events like Seniors Walk on Tuesday mornings and Family Nature Night on Fridays. Throughout the presentation, murmurs rippled through the audience. Some residents nodded appreciatively at the visuals, while others frowned in confusion. James noticed several people turning to look at him with questioning expressions. When Deborah finally paused for questions, James raised his hand. Deborah scanned the room, deliberately ignoring him, while calling on others who asked about implementation timelines and maintenance responsibilities. After several minutes, Dave Johnson, who lived 2 doors down from James, spoke up. "I think James has something to say, and since this appears to be about his property, we should hear him out." Deborah's smile tightened. "This is an HOA meeting for community members only. Mr. Wilson is not part of our association." "Then why are we discussing his land?" called out Ms. Reynolds, her voice carrying the authority of her 30 years as a teacher. Several voices muttered in agreement. The vice president of the board, a gray-haired man named Tom, leaned forward and whispered something to Deborah, who appeared increasingly agitated. "Fine," she conceded sharply. "You have 2 minutes, Mr. Wilson." James stood and walked calmly to the front of the room. He turned to face the residents, many of whom he'd known for years. "Thank you for allowing me to speak," he began. "I want to clarify something important. The property being discussed is privately owned by me. It is not part of Oak Ridge Estates and has never been subject to HOA governance. I have documentation confirming this, which I've already provided to the board." Several board members nodded in confirmation, causing Deborah to shoot them a sharp look. "While I appreciate the interest in my property," James continued, "I have no intention of converting it into public space. I value my privacy and the natural state of the land, which is why I've maintained it as is for 15 years. Deborah interrupted, her voice rising. "What Mr. Wilson isn't telling you is that his selfishness is depriving all of you, all of us, of valuable green space. He's hoarding natural resources that could benefit everyone, especially families with children who need safe outdoor areas." The Saturday morning was unseasonably warm for late April. perfect for the errands James had planned. He spent nearly 2 hours at the farmer's market and grocery store, his trunk filled with supplies for the week and seedlings for his vegetable garden. As he turned onto his street around noon, he noticed an unusual number of cars parked along the roadway near his property. His first thought was that perhaps a neighbor was hosting a gathering. That assumption evaporated as he pulled into his driveway. Through the trees that lined his property, he could see splashes of color, people moving around his pond. For a moment, he sat frozen in disbelief. James left his groceries in the car and walked briskly toward the pond. As he cleared the trees, he was met with an astonishing sight. Deborah Miller, clipboard in hand, stood near the water's edge addressing a group of about 15 residents. She wore khaki shorts, hiking boots, and a polo shirt with what appeared to be a newly created logo, Oak Ridge Estates Nature Trail, embroidered alongside the HOA emblem. "The playground equipment will be installed here," she was saying, gesturing dramatically to a flat area near the pond. "We'll need to clear some of these smaller trees, but our landscape architect assures me it won't affect the wildlife habitat significantly." Several residents were taking notes. Others wandered along his private trail, examining the surroundings as if assessing a property they were considering purchasing. A man James didn't recognize was hammering his stake with a bright orange ribbon into the ground near his favorite bench spot. "What's going on here?" James called out, his voice steady despite the anger rising in his chest. The group turned in unison. Several faces immediately registered embarrassment, while others looked confused. Deborah, however, merely checked her watch with an annoyed expression. "We're conducting the scheduled site survey," she stated as if explaining something obvious. "As I mentioned at the meeting, we need to map out the enhancements before we can create a proper budget proposal." "You're all trespassing on private property," James said firmly, addressing the entire group. "I never gave permission for this survey, and I've made it clear that this land is not part of Oak Ridge Estates." An uncomfortable murmur spread through the group. A woman James recognized from down the street leaned toward her husband and whispered something that made him frown at Deborah. "Don't be ridiculous," Deborah countered, her voice rising. "We're acting on behalf of the community. The access issues are being resolved through proper channels." "What proper channels?" James asked. "Because legal ownership of this property is not in question. You're trespassing, and I'm asking you all to leave immediately." Several neighbors began backing away, muttering apologies. Others looked to Deborah for guidance, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "We have community authority to be here," Deborah insisted, though her voice had lost some of its certainty. She turned to the remaining group. "Please continue with the survey. Mr. Wilson is simply trying to intimidate us." James pulled out his phone and dialed the non-emergency number for the county sheriff's department. He explained the situation calmly, aware that several more neighbors were now quietly making their way toward the exit path. 20 minutes later, a sheriff's deputy's vehicle pulled up to James' driveway. By that time, only Deborah and 3 others remained on the property, a man still taking measurements of the pond's perimeter, and an older couple who seemed to be arguing quietly with Deborah. Deputy Rodriguez, whom James recognized from community events, assessed the situation quickly. She explained to the remaining group that they were indeed trespassing on private property and could face criminal charges if they didn't leave immediately. "But we have authorization from the Homeowners Association," Deborah protested, producing a folder of documents. The deputy barely glanced at them. "Ma'am, a homeowners association has no legal authority to grant access to private property that isn't under its jurisdiction. Unless Mr. Wilson gives permission, which he clearly hasn't, you are trespassing. I'm asking you politely to leave now." The older couple and the man with the measuring tape quickly apologized to both James and the deputy, hurrying toward the path that led off the property. Deborah remained rooted in place, her face flushed with anger. "This is an abuse of power," she declared, looking from James to the deputy. "The community needs this space. We have rights too." "Your final warning, ma'am," Deputy Rodriguez stated firmly. "Leave now, or I'll have to issue you a citation for criminal trespass, which could result in fines and potentially arrest if you return." Finally, Deborah gathered her clipboard, and the certified letter arrived on Tuesday morning, requiring James's signature before the postal worker would release it. The return address showed Greenfield, Morris and Associates, attorneys at law, a firm James had never heard of. He signed for the envelope with a sense of foreboding. Inside was a formal legal letter on heavy cream-colored stationery, addressed to property owner, 1472 Lakeside Drive. The letterhead indicated the firm was based in a city about 50 miles away, suggesting Deborah had purposely sought representation outside their immediate area. "Dear Mr. Wilson," the letter began, "this firm represents the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association in the matter of establishing an easement by necessity of the portion of your property containing the existing natural path, pond area, and adjacent recreational spaces." James read the 3-page document twice, his engineering mind struggling to parse the deliberately convoluted legal language. The letter claimed the HOA was initiating proceedings to secure legal access to his property based on several dubious arguments: that the land was originally meant to be part of the development, that historical use had established precedent, and most absurdly, that residents needed access to the natural beauty and recreational opportunities his property provided for their physical and emotional well-being. The letter demanded he cease obstruction of community access, while the matter was adjudicated, and threatened significant legal consequences if he continued to impede the community's rightful use of the natural resources. James immediately called Michael Brennan, his poker buddy and a real estate attorney with 20 years of experience. Michael agreed to meet him for lunch that same day. Michael paused as he finished reading the letter, searching for the right word. Ambitious. They sat at a corner table in a local diner, plates of half-eaten sandwiches pushed aside. And by ambitious, I mean completely unfounded. Michael explained that easement by necessity was a specific legal concept that applied primarily when a property was landlocked and required access across another property to reach a public road. It had nothing to do with recreational access or emotional well-being. The firm that sent this specializes in commercial real estate development, Michael noted, examining the letterhead. I'm guessing your HOA president either misrepresented the situation to them or found the one attorney willing to write whatever she asked for. James sighed. What about you now? Let me handle this, Michael replied, his expression shifting from amused to determined. This crosses the line from annoying to potentially damaging. They're making legal threats based on completely false premises. The next morning, Michael's secretary called to request James's complete property records, the previous HOA letters, and a written account of all interactions with Deborah and the HOA. James spent that evening compiling everything into a comprehensive file, including photos of the trespassing incident and a statement from Deputy Rodriguez. 3 days later, Michael sent James a draft of his response. It was a masterpiece of professional legal writing, 7 pages of meticulously cited case law, property statutes, and firm rebuttals of every claim. It concluded with a clear cease and desist demand and detailed the potential consequences if the harassment continued: criminal trespass charges, civil damages for harassment, possible personal liability for HOA board members who knowingly participated in unlawful actions, and potential ethics complaints against any attorney who continued to pursue clearly frivolous claims. This should end it, Michael said when James called to approve the letter. I'm sending it to their attorney, every HOA board member individually, and courtesy copies to the County Property Records Office and Sheriff's Department. I'd also included documentation showing we're prepared to file for a restraining order if necessary. James winced at the $1,200 invoice attached to the email, but considered it money well spent. That evening, as he walked along his private trail, watching the sunset reflect on his pond, he felt a weight lifting. The legal response felt like a turning point. Finally, professional boundaries being established that even Deborah couldn't ignore. His moment of peace was interrupted by the chime of his phone. It was a text from Tom, the HOA vice president. Emergency board meeting called for tomorrow night. You might want to know. The Oak Ridge Estates Community Center was much quieter when James arrived the following evening at 7 p.m. Instead of the packed meeting room from before, he was directed to a smaller conference room where 4 people sat around an oval table. Tom Wilson, the vice president, Sarah Chen, the treasurer, Marcus Diaz, the secretary, and Eleanor Phillips, the community liaison. The notable absence was Deborah Miller. Tom rose to greet James with a firm handshake. Thank you for coming, James. Please have a seat. The atmosphere was markedly different from the previous meeting, tense but respectful. Each board member had a folder open before them containing what James recognized as copies of his property documentation and Michael's legal letter. Tom cleared his throat. First and foremost, on behalf of the entire board, I want to offer our sincere apology for this situation. We spent the last 24 hours reviewing all the documentation and consulting with our regular HOA attorney, not the one who sent you that letter. Sarah, the treasurer, nodded gravely. We were misled about several critical facts. Deborah told the board your property was originally designated as common space in the initial development plans, but was erroneously titled to the previous owners. She also claimed there was a written agreement granting residents access rights that you were violating, added Marcus, adjusting his glasses. We never saw this supposed agreement, but took her word that it existed. Eleanor, a retired paralegal, looked particularly disturbed. The legal letter was sent without proper board authorization. Deborah approached this outside firm independently, paid their retainer from her personal funds, and merely informed us that legal steps were being taken without specifics. James listened, surprised by these revelations. I appreciate your candor. This clarifies a lot. Tom sighed heavily. When we received copies of your attorney's response yesterday, we immediately called an emergency session and voted to conduct a full review. What we found was he paused, searching for the right word, troubling. Deborah falsified meeting minutes to show board approval for actions never discussed, Eleanor explained. She used HOA letterhead without authorization for those threatening letters, and she apparently told several residents they lose property value if they didn't support her trail initiative. Marcus slid a document across the table to James. It was a formal resolution on HOA letterhead with all 4 signatures. We voted unanimously to remove Deborah as president effective immediately for actions unbecoming a board member and misuse of position, Tom explained. We've also drafted a formal apology to be sent to all residents explaining that the HOA has no claim whatsoever to your property and never sanctioned any of the actions taken against you. Sarah added, our regular attorney is also contacting the firm that sent you that letter to formally withdraw any claims and clarify that they were made without proper authorization. James felt a complex mixture of vindication and lingering frustration. What about the residents who were misled into trespassing? The community-wide letter will address that too, Eleanor assured him. We're making it absolutely clear that your property is private and not accessible without your explicit permission. The meeting concluded with sincere apologies and handshakes all around. As James walked to his car, Tom followed him out. Just so you know, he said quietly, Deborah's already put her house on the market. Apparently, she's moving to a condo development across town. He shook his head. Some people just aren't cut out for community living. In the weeks that followed, James noticed subtle but meaningful changes. The formal apology letter appeared in everyone's mailbox, and several neighbors stopped by with personal apologies and small peace offerings. Homemade bread, bottles of wine, offers to help with yard work. Ms. Reynolds brought her grandchildren over with a handmade "thank you for being a good neighbor" card. While a few residents still gave James cool looks at the grocery store, those who had been most enthusiastic about Deborah's vision, most were understanding and seemed eager to put the incident behind them. One evening in late May, as James sat on his deck watching a family of ducks navigate his pond, he had an idea. The next day, he drafted a letter to the new HOA president. Tom had been elected to complete Deborah's term, proposing a community picnic on his property, once a year on the summer solstice by invitation only. As a gesture of goodwill and to share the natural beauty I'm fortunate to enjoy,